So I was asked to speak at this event several weeks ago, but I declined because I did not have any information to share on the water grant, how it was going to be distributed, how do you go about getting it. And literally 3 minutes ago, I received an email. So I'm going to share it with you. So y'all have the heads up as to what's going on. I don't have my glasses. Okay. The 1944 Water Treaty Grant is a non-competitive grant program, which some people don't know. They're in a hurry to get it. It's not competitive. It provides economic relief to producers impacted by Mexico's failure to meet water obligations under the 1944 treaty. TDA will host optional workshops to provide hands-on assistance with the application process. Participation is not required. These sessions are available for applicants who would like additional support. So, if you're going to go apply for this, this is what you need. Authorized irrigation certificate number, documentation of irrigation district or TCEQ water rights, documentation of the total number of irrigatable acres. That's what you need. So I'm going to give you some dates really quickly. So this week, April 22nd through the 25th, the regional office in San Juan is there available to answer questions for you guys. Next week, on April 30th, there's a location in Laredo at the Webb County Extension Office from 8 to 5. So Webb County Extension Office, April 30th, Laredo, 8 to 5. And then the last one is Cameron County Annex in San Benito, May 1st. So those are dates to put on your calendar if you are going to apply for the water grant. And also one other thing, before you can apply for the water grant, you have to create an account in TDA Go. And once you create an account, it takes about 3 days for that account to be active. So you can't just sign up and sign in for the grant all in one day. It's a little bit of a process. My advice is if you're going to go to one of these workshops for help, create your TDA account prior to, so when you go there, you can actually register for the loan. That's it.
So, our final panel today is about harnessing data for impact in food, agriculture, and policy. So really, this is a panel about power, the power of information. In agriculture, data is more than spreadsheets and statistics. It's a storytelling tool, a policy lever, and a way to secure resources and recognition. This panel will explore how data can help us advocate, plan, and build stronger systems. If you've ever wondered how to use data meaningfully, not just collect it, this is a conversation for you. Our moderator for this final panel is Dr. Alexis Rossellis. He holds the Houston Endowed Chair for Science and Technology at UTRGV, where he directs the Agroecology and Resilient Food Systems program and co-directs the Center for Sustainable Agriculture and Rural Advancement. His work integrates participatory research, community-engaged scholarship, and equity-driven science to advance food systems in South Texas. As a moderator on this panel, Dr. Rossellis brings a deep understanding of how data, when rooted in community and used intentionally, can drive meaningful change in agriculture, policy, and regional resilience. Not only that, he is the co-founder of the Food Summit, and we welcome him back again. Thank you all.
Okay, well, thank you, Bella, for the introduction, and I appreciate you saving the best session for last. No, actually, I know that the best sessions are the one with the youth on it. It's always the annual winner in terms of popularity. But I think the panel of experts that we have today are very important as well, not just because of the work that they do, but because they also help us with information and with data, collecting that valuable information to help inform us on how to advance our food system. So we have today with us is Gabriela Gallegos, who's with the UT Health, Houston School of Public Health in El Paso. She's the one right here, the third from me. I should have started on that side, sorry. Lisa Michelle Bennett is with UT Health Houston here in Brownsville. We have with us also Paul Figueroa, who is with the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance. And finally, Rocio Hernandez, who's with Idea Farms. So these four experts, panelists, it will serve as our panelists today as we discuss and explore the important role of information. As you heard Bella say, this very famous saying we know is information is power, right? There's a quote by a lady by the name of Mary Beard, who was an activist and suffragist who fought for women's rights in the 1800s. And she has a quote that I put on the syllabus of every course that I teach. And the quote is that information without action is futile, and action without information is fatal, right? If we don't know what we're doing, we're prone to make some errors, right? And if we don't do anything when we have information, then it's useless. That's the story that I give to my students, because I'm in the business of training students on how to generate information so that we can progress our economies, we can progress our environments, and we can progress our societies. So the connection today on this panel is about data, and how do we use data to inform action. And so I'd like to open some broad questions to the panel about, just asking you the basic question, well, what is data for you? And how do we use that data? How do you use that data in your work to advance food systems, in your field? So we'll start with Rocio.
Testing.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. First off, I feel really humbled to have been selected to be on this panel, especially during the final session when I can tell everybody is falling asleep, really tired and ready to go home. Bear with us. So your question, Alex, I think data is everything. As far as coming from the lens of a farm-to-school program, we cannot operate and continue to be funded without showing a report on the impact for our families and our students and our communities. So on a daily, on a weekly, on a monthly, on a quarterly, on an annually, we are constantly having to report back our numbers. How many students are consuming X amount of product? What is the most popular product that our students are eating? How are our crops being, how are they culturally relevant? How many educational hours are each farm? What's the capacity of educational hours for each farm, right? So really, we have to report these numbers to our bosses, and then their bosses to their bosses, and then from that point on, we're able to continue to request funding and get stronger every year, ideally to be able to have more capacity to reach more students, more families, and the real big goal is to have programs like ours replicate in other school districts. We don't want to just hold on to what we're doing, lock and key. We want other districts to be able to do and generate the same numbers and the same impact. Did I answer that question?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because data, we all use data differently. Rocio, as you guys might know, is the Farm to School Program Manager with a school district here in the Rio Grande Valley and beyond. Actually, the Idea Public Schools is in multiple states at this point. And so, her idea of what information she gets from the data that she collects as program manager might be different from that of you, Lisa and Gabriela. And you both work in the public health field. I'm curious, what is data to you guys, and what kind of data is most useful for the work that you both do? Maybe we could start with you, Lisa.
Yeah, I think just kind of going back to the history of the School of Public Health here in the Valley, and I see some other friends from other institutions as well. in the region, we had a history of academic people coming in and extracting data from our community, and we'd never see it. It would never really have any impact. Oftentimes we didn't even know what they were doing with it. And so more recent in the last couple decades, we have more local institutions doing the type of research that's actually leads to action, like you're saying. So I think there's still a lot of data that is collected in a void that's not useful for our local population. But the way that I use it in my work, because I actually do program management, project management, is that while we are a research institution, we do nothing without partners, without community partners. We never get any kind of a research grant or come up with even a research question that's not completely been vetted and engaged and come from our community partners. We have a collaborative action board that's 22 years running with cross-sector organizations. And from that, so the data that we collect could be for sort of academic research, but it's also always leading to some type of an intervention to address what we're finding. In our case, we look more at chronic disease and obesity, diabetes, and all of depression, the comorbidities of those diseases. But the way that we collect data is super important, because you can collect data and find all of the problems, which is historically what we've found. People would come in and say, oh, this is there's persistent poverty, there's high rates of diabetes. But when you're engaged with local organizations, when you're doing community engaged research, you find also the resilience factors. You find the assets of a community, and you build programs like from our research was the Brownsville Wellness Coalition was born out of our collaborative action board. Gosh, almost 20 years ago. I see some of our friends here from that coalition, and that was the first farmers market in the valley. It was, community gardens, urban farms. So I think a lot can come from collecting data, but it's got to be shared with the people who it matters to.
Thank you. So thank you all for hanging in there. Am I on? Am I mic? All right. Okay, better. All right, so thank you all for hanging in there with us. So my name is Gabriela Gallegos. I am from El Paso with UT Health Houston also. And I'm a lawyer and policy analyst by background. So I think my ideas of data and what it looks like might be a little bit different from traditional research. I've also owned a small business. And so I think the most basic way that I think of data is feedback, right? And all of you are collecting it all the time in different ways. So as a small business owner, it might be as a producer, you're thinking about what will sell, what products are there, what does the market look like, how many employees do I have, how much time does it take to do something. So there's a lot of different ways that I think data is happening in your everyday life that provides you real-time feedback. But somehow the concept of data has become a four-letter word of, it's not used for our own benefit, right? And it is something that others are doing and kind of coming in, as Lisa was mentioning, to take from us to use for other things. But all of you are already collecting data in different ways. And it's something that you can use, share with each other, and it's very, very powerful, right? So in the way that I see data, I think about it as using that to provide stories and information to decision makers so that they might make funding decisions, policy decisions that will benefit the community that I serve. I work with El Paso County on a number of programs. I also work with nonprofits, and I'm part of the Regional Food Business Center that we've been hearing so much about today. And in all of those ways, there's different opportunities to collect data, to share data, to use data to make better decisions, and to use it to advocate for the things that you need. So I think not thinking about data as something that is removed and that others are doing, but thinking about it as something that we have and need and can use can be very empowering in being able to use it effectively.
Okay, thank you. And this is a perfect segue because Paul is a policy director with the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance. Paul, I was wondering if you can answer the same question and maybe tell us a specific example of how your organization has used data either you've collected or you've gathered and being able to put that into action.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming and listening. I'm tired like all of you. I made the very long journey from the nation of Puerto Rico to come here. So a little bit of jet lag, but excited to be sharing with all of you. So, my background is a little bit different in how I came into FARFA and how I came into working in data. So I got into policy work as a campaign consultant. So I've run city council campaigns, I've worked on campaigns even for governor's races, so at all sorts of different levels I've done, this kind of really very intense data, really related to polls and to voters and to public opinion. But before I was doing that, I was a reading teacher. Someone with a background as a reading teacher that then committed themselves to working in their activism full time, I'm really interested in how we can elevate stories, how we can elevate people's experiences, how we can create a narrative with the data that we're using. I come from 8 generations of family farmers. I'm not a farmer. My mother used to like to say that now that I worked with farmers, I was one now, and that would be her excuse to get me to come out and help. But data that I like to use when I'm meeting, for example, with lawmakers, with members of Congress, is that if we look at the USDA Census of Agriculture, the small American family farm is on path to be extinct within the next 30 years. So if we think about, how the United States, we have this idea that this is a nation of farmers, that farmers are integral to our communities, to our identity, and that is going to potentially disappear within the next 30 years, that's something that gets members of Congress attention, right? They're like, well, what do you mean the American family farm is declining at such a rapid pace, right? And then by taking the data, taking the numbers that we have, we're able to take that narrative, a narrative that I understand coming from a family of farmers, and saying, no, this is the reason why, this is the numbers behind it, this is the dollars and cents behind it. So I think it's really elevating those narratives, elevating those experiences and stories that we all know and that we've all lived, but really being able to quantify it, particularly for those in power.
Okay, well, thank you. This is perfect because, so some of you guys who've been on the panels, there's a few of you still left in the audience. We actually had a prep call last week, right? And the schedule had changed. So now we're the final session here. And in an effort to maybe make this session a little bit more vibrant, I think we agreed. I listened. I wasn't actually on the call because I wasn't able to log on live. I think we agreed that we are going to try to have more of a discussion. And so I'm going to prod a little bit and maybe try to put these folks a little bit in the hot seat. And I know you guys are used to it, so I hope you just don't mind because you've both, all of you guys have said a few things to me that stand out, right? I mean, I myself, I'm a scientist. I work a lot with soils. I work with a lot in this field of sustainable agriculture and resilient food systems. So there's been a few things that you guys have mentioned that I think I'd like to pursue and explore a little bit deeper. For example, this concept of a narrative, right? When we think of data, at the moment you say data, I have a bit of PTSD. I see spreadsheets, right? And it's like the matrix where there's a bunch of numbers just kind of going up and down. And that's what I think a lot of us think of when we think of data. I'm sure if you tell a 7th grader, oh, data science, they imagine sitting in front of a computer, right? But you, at least with you, Gabriela, and you, Paul, folks who worked in policy, you talk about this concept of taking that data and crafting a narrative, right? And crafting the story. And I think I bring this up because we're seeing some recent examples of folks maybe even ignoring the data and crafting their own story, and that becomes the dominant narrative, right? Oh, well, this is not happening. This is actually happening. And so where do we find a balance of taking data for the sake of having that to generate information, and where do we maybe build skills in crafting narratives, which a lot of scientists like myself were never trained to do, right? If you take some of the work I've done and you read it, it's largely inaccessible to most people. You know, in many ways. First of all, you have to pay sometimes to read it, and then secondly, you have to interpret it, and it's in a language that most of us can't understand. So I want to just kind of throw this out there, like, how do we, as panelists and people in the audience, how do we generate the narrative that's most close to the truth? And then how can we use that narrative and maybe corroborated by data to really kind of push an agenda that we want, whether it be policy, whether it be public health, whether it be education. So I'd like to maybe start with you, Rocio. Like, what do you do in terms of, how do you see your role in crafting a narrative that has resonance, that has impact?
That's definitely the hot seat. I think when I think of data within the lens of the farm to school program, I think of numbers, right? And sure, as a staff monitoring education hours, poundage, how much cabbage we grew, all of that is relevant. But when it comes to our audience, which is our students, essentially our customer base, that's where the whole narrative comes in, right? We're on the farms, and qualitative data is just as valuable as quantitative data. And so I think the best kind of data is those lived experiences from these students that are going out to the farms, that have never put their hands in the soil, right? That are being asked to count ladybugs. Why? Right? So they're taking back these lived experiences on the daily, on the weekly, and as staff, we're taking these stories, and I'm going to be honest, we don't do the best job of tracking these stories. That's definitely a grow for us. And sure, it can probably have a lot more value and impact if we had a bigger foundation to sharing these stories, but we're seeing it in the spark, in the joy, they're like little walking marketing systems. They go back after they leave the farms, and they go inside their campuses, and they're like, let's go back to the farm, right? And they're communicating these stories. And that, I mean, it's not your traditional data, but it's helping us build a bigger platform for the work that we're doing. And so just harnessing that over and over just feels really, really powerful.
And I think we saw that today, right? We had a panel moderated by Mackenzie Feldman about building the next generation of leaders in the RGV. And you can hear and sense that enthusiasm. Those three panelists, Andrew, Marcos, and Caitlin, they gave us some information, right, about the importance of that experience. And now it's hard, right, because then you take those three, and how do you take those narratives of patients, of cases, or farmers? I know that Paul, for example, your organization encourages stakeholders, farmers in particular, to come to Congress and testify in Austin. And in my experience, those testimonies from these 10 or 12 individuals have as much weight as the most comprehensive data set that you can provide them electronically, right? And so tell me a little bit about that, like how do you get that information, and how do you encourage those folks to advocate for some of the initiatives that your organization is leading right now? Maybe even tell us about some of those initiatives as well.
And I wanted to touch briefly on a point that you made about analyzing information in an era of misinformation, right? Coming from a political background of working on candidates, right, we're used to attacks being made on any side about any particular issue, or accusations being made on any particular issue, and some of them may be true and some of them may be not true. And I think for us to find the truth in that, I think rooting ourselves in data is a way of doing that. I think what disarms misinformation is being able to say, you know, well, this is what the truth is. It's not enough to say that's not true. It's no, what really is the truth. So if I'm saying, for example, at FARFA we focus on regulatory burdens, and we can say, well, there's burdens on small farmers and producers. Someone else could say, well, maybe that's not so. Well, okay, well, we have the data that says this is true. I'm living this as a farmer, so I know this to be true. So then it's reaffirming what our truth is. And I think that's a lot of what we do at FARFA. So for example, we're focusing on the Local Foods Act and PRIME Act in the US Congress. Both of those bills seek to remove unnecessary burdens on our meat producers, on our meat processors. So we know that's an issue. We know the burden exists. It's not just for us, you know, we know that it's more than us policy folks reading over the law and saying, well, we don't like this sentence of the law, we want to change it, right? Because that's all rooted in the data, like I was saying. We have the data on the decline of small livestock producers across the United States. But then we also have your own stories, you know. How long does it take to get a spot to go to a federally inspected meat processing facility? You know, how many hours does it take you to drive to go to that facility, right? So we all know it. And I think getting farmers together to say, you know, this is my experience, and not just one person, but when it's 4, when it's 5, when it's 10, they're in those hearings, when a legislator can say, well, this person's from my district, this person's from my district, it becomes much more clear than maybe me as a policy person that more often than not, I don't live in the district of the legislator that I'm meeting with and I'm telling them this information, right? For them to be able to see that and to hear that, I think it makes it very real to folks in power.
That's an important concept, right? Because Lisa, you were telling, I mean, how important it is to collect locally relevant data. I mean, and El Paso it has its own challenges. Some of them overlap with the public health challenges we have in our RGV. I'm curious if you can kind of, and Lisa, actually, you mentioned this concept of resilience, and you know, it's a word that we hear quite a bit, right? And I'm curious on maybe you can tell us, how do you measure resilience? And then of course, what do you do with that information once you have that data to say, hey, these are how ways that we measure resilience, and we can improve resilience, at least in terms of public health. So maybe those are questions that both of you guys can address.
I mean, I think first I want to just address kind of that importance. My original background in my first life was journalism, and so I'm used to interviewing people and listening to their stories. And I think as government agencies, in research, and in universities, we have a very hard time just listening to the people who actually, like you mentioned, have the lived experience. Asking the why. I think Jackie in the last panel said, you know, why, maybe not making assumptions that people don't value something, but really asking them, like, why are you not interested in this food, or why are you not buying this food? So really, first and foremost, centering the people who you're actually doing the research about, or the data that you're collecting, or the policy that is important that you're pushing. And so I think really stepping back and listening, the qualitative piece is so important. And in terms of just resilience and assets, I mean, I think there are measures. I don't want to go into the kind of the boring piece of it, but working with people and saying, you know, why is this a problem? Why is this a barrier? And how are you solving it? And we work a lot with promotores de salud, so community health workers. They're from local communities where we're working, and they are always able to explain the why and to say, this is how, you know, I'm getting around this challenge. This is how we're addressing this challenge. And you know, we've been able to see design programs with their leadership, under their leadership, and thanks to the qualitative data that we're able to collect, because we hear their stories and we amplify their stories using behavioral journalism, you know, in local media. I think that you know, we've been able to have programs that we can actually see improved rates of diabetes in Cameron County. Like, we're actually able to track it over time, and it's not because some university researcher is doing research. It's because local people are saying, somebody is listening to me. What do you think the solution is? We come from a valley, as we all know, of people who, their parents or grandparents worked as farm workers in Mexico or in the United States. We were an agricultural region for many years. And people don't necessarily not want healthy food or local organic food. There are barriers, and we've really just got to listen and interact with people and ask them, like businesses do, right? You get feedback, you do market testing, and I think there's a disconnect between the institutions that might be promoting programs and interventions and policies and just people and listening. I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, yeah, I mean, Jackie,
she's gone, I think.
Jacqueline was here, yeah, and she had mentioned, this. She also mentioned this kind of the narrative, right? I mean, and I think being able to ensure, first of all, that accurate, data drives that narrative, and so that we have the most accurate information. And sometimes in the public health sector, we see that the most the information is actually driven by other industries or organizations. I'll give you a great example. I mean, one of our very close partners with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, Robert Maggiani, who many of you guys know, he wasn't able to join us today, but he actually told me a story about, some of the best data collectors are supermarkets, right? They know exactly what people want, because whatever's left in the supermarket, they're like, oh, they left all the cucumbers that are 7 inches and below, and they left all these huge cucumbers because nobody wants to eat a 12-inch cucumber. So for whatever reason, they take all this information, they aggregate that data, and they say, we want a 9-inch cucumber, right? And so if you don't grow a cucumber that's 9 inches, we're not going to pay you full price, because we don't get full price because the consumer, for whatever reason. And I remember him telling me this story, because then he says, they're driving the narrative. Folks here in the valley, it's very difficult to grow a 9-inch cucumber, and it's very hard to compete with Mexico, because they just do it perfectly, for whatever reason. And so how do we get folks who grow cucumbers in a place like the Rio Grande Valley, how do we get them competitive? How do we get them to grow a 9-inch cucumber, or do we get people to buy 7 to 8-inch cucumbers? So his recommendation was to try and work with school districts, because when we talk to school districts, they say, oh, we just open the box and we chop them up anyway. Nobody measures it, And so we're like, what, can you buy a 7-inch cucumber? Sure, if it's the same price. So actually we get better price, because the farmer will sell it to us, and better yet, if they sell it to us directly, we can even pay them more, or so these kinds of action plans come through like listening and through understanding different viewpoints, and then also understanding who controls the information and the narrative, right? And who is best positioned to use that information, right? And I think maybe, Gabriela, you can talk about how in public health, we have a lot of other interests, non-public interests in the health field. And you might know more about it with your background in law than I do, right? So I wanted to kind of, your current work with UT Health, like how do you reconcile the dynamic of power in terms of information, and then how do you ensure that the information from the data that you all are collecting, actually we can harness to benefit the people that you work with and you serve?
I think part of it is making sure that it's shared, right, and not siloed. You mentioned some of the, challenges that we have in academia with accessing information, right? How it's written, as well as how you access it, literally how you buy that article to read. But we don't have to do it only that way, right? I think the university is set up to give incentives to academics who are publishing in a very specific way, but that is not the community need, right? So if we're thinking about how do we serve the public in public health, and how do we provide the information that will enable people every day to make better decisions, it really requires us and demands that we share it back, right? In an understandable way that is easy to access, that is actionable, right? So I think we've heard from every panelist how that double-edged companion of data in numbers and data in storytelling is really essential, right? And I think that's how you speak to policymakers, that's how you make change, and that's how we speak to each other, right? This is what we're seeing in the numbers, but let me tell you what that actually means, right? I was able to hire 3 new people. That means that the people who were previously shorthanded and doing every job that there is are now able to go out and find new opportunities for markets, right? And find new ways to connect with others. So what does that mean on a day-to-day basis is very different from I check the box of hiring 3 new people, right? So it changes people's lives in a very obvious way. But I think the root of what you're asking is just how do we share it back? And part of it is talking to each other, right? And it doesn't have to only be academics or researchers that are collecting data, but it can be members of the community, consumers, producers, retailers. It can be all elements who are collecting their own information, being able to share it with each other to better, advance the cause, right? Whether that is making sure that there's available markets, whether it's making sure that, you are finding out how do you sell that cucumber that is apparently not going to sell at a particular supermarket. Okay, well, one of the things we've done is, chop it up, put some tajin, and now we have fruit cups that we're able to increase the margin on, and everybody wins, right? So, there are creative options, but if we're not sharing best practices with each other, in addition to sharing kind of more traditional research that is collected back out with the community, I think that there's a giant gap, and it does not help us move forward kind of the entire food system.
Well, let me ask you, and you know what, Lisa, I kind of put a question mark here because I asked you about resilience, and we're going to go back to that because I have that question for you. How do you measure resilience? But let me ask you, Gabriela, a follow-up question. I mean, a lot of folks are hesitant to share information, right? Because as Bella said, information's power, and sometimes you have to compromise, right? And saying, hey, look, I mean, actually, if I could keep this to myself, maybe I have a little bit of a market advantage or a business advantage, but if I share this in some ways, how do you encourage or you incentivize information sharing? And can you give us an example of how you see it done well?
I think it's really difficult because we live in a capitalistic society, right? And so we are thinking about our competitors and how does that change kind of the work that we're doing. But if we share information and consider that we can grow the entire pie rather than fighting each other for the same slice, I think there's opportunity to harness that information. Thinking about a specific example, there may be folks who are nearby. I know that we were going to touch on asset mapping in this panel as well. And thinking about all of the resources that you have, what your neighbors might have. One might have land, another might have, people who are working for them that they're not able to pay full time, right? But together you might actually be able to make better use of that one person, have them full time, use a portion of your land for a crop that they needed overflow for. So there's ways that the information that you have can be shared with another kind of like-minded person, right, or business or organization, to be able to kind of work together to grow the pie rather than be competing over that same slice that everybody's after. Now, of course, practically speaking, that's not always possible, and we know that food it's incredibly competitive, and margins are incredibly tight, right? So it may not always make sense, but considering where you might have something to offer that could be built upon, right, or where you might need something that others may be able to share with you, could be a really important way to start thinking as a community to advance the full system and make those choices very selectively so that it can benefit all.
Okay, that's a great answer. I'm digesting it myself. I'm going to go back to you, Lisa, about this question about resilience. And you mentioned it, right? And I do need, because I mean, I work with farmers and I work with municipalities. I hear the word a lot, and it's very difficult I have a hard time understanding what it means for folks, right? Like, I don't see, I see some of the farmers I work with, to me they embody resilience, right? To be able to plant something, I mean, first of all, I find them to be inspirational people of faith, because they put something in the ground believing that there's going to be enough moisture, enough water accessible, and that thing is going to be able to grow, and that they're going to be able to sell it and make a living out of it, right? And year after year, there's challenges here in the valley: drought, fluctuating prices for commodities and other crops. There is floods when you don't have prolonged periods of drought. We've got tremendous pest pressures, and yet these farmers, who I admire because of this resilience. Now that we're talking about data, how do you measure that?
I mean, there are measures, there are academic measures of resilience, but I think our point is that, do they really matter? For one thing, I think, you've just given us a great measure of resilience. I think there are qualitative ways to measure resilience. I think in our community, since we started working together, it's not agriculture necessarily related, although some initiatives have come out of it around food systems. We know that people are talking about, they are exercising more. We have seen, we have businesses coming up because of initiatives that were grown from the community, particularly in Brownsville. We have collaborations across 12 municipalities. They never talked to each other. They used to compete, and now they're getting funding for trail, hike and bike trail infrastructure. I mean, there are many examples of, including, very public healthy type diabetes rates and obesity rate, watching that while the rest of the country is going up. We're slightly going down. We're definitely not getting worse. So that's kind of the data piece. There are measures for resilience that are very academic that I feel are actually not even super relevant to people, but I think it's the stories of and the evidence of engagement. Are there more community gardens, school farm programs? Are people talking about the importance of being physically active and eating fruits and vegetables and learning, planting their gardens at home? I think it's those kind of anecdotal evidence, but that we all know that despite our persistent poverty in our region, despite all of the challenges that we have, being a militarized border, all of the, now the threats of mass deportation, all of the things that people face here, we know that families are still strong. They're working hard. Kids are, going to school. They're progressing, and so I think we get to decide, not me, but the community gets to decide what resilience is, and we need to start defining that. There are some very specific tools that we can use, but I honestly think they're so academic that they wouldn't mean anything to people. And so I'm really glad that you sort of described it yourself. You described resilience.
Well, and in the end, it's, information that leads to action, right? And so sometimes some of the academic information, and I've struggled with trying to collect this in an academic way, that doesn't lead to action, is futile, right? Like Mary Beard would say. And so, it's a discussion that I'd like to also offer the audience. We have about 15 minutes left in our panel. First of all, I'd like to, just kind of thank you guys for your wisdom so far. I can tell that there's a lot of expertise on this stage, and I'd also not just encourage audience members to ask questions to them, but feel free to ask each other questions, because one thing that I have learned over the last few years of this food summit is that it is these conversations, learning from each other's experience, even though they're different. I mean, you said on a prep call that, hey, look, I don't work with agricultural producers, I work in public health. But anyone who works in the food system understands just how closely linked those are. Right, and that your experiences as a program manager, or policy advocates, or health professionals, your experiences can tell us, can help inform us on how we do our own work. So, I'd like to just invite the last 15 minutes for you guys to ask each other questions, or even the panel, the audience. Feel free to ask a question to the panel. I think Diana might have one. Yeah.
The farm to school's always been really interesting to me. And I see we have at-risk kids that we've been doing for about 4 years. And I know the change in the things that they write for us. Oh, I never tried this vegetable and blah, blah, blah. But have you ever been approached with a child that left the school, came back and said to you, this made a difference to me?
Short answer, yes. Long answer, it was a very emotional moment. The program at Idea Public Schools, which many of you are familiar with, if you're not, we have 11 total farms in the state of Texas, 1 in Louisiana. A lot of folks here in the room have had a lot of hands in making it successful. So thank you for that. But Diana, to your question, it's been operating for about 20-ish years. I think our 20th anniversary is really, really soon. And so we've had the opportunity to have students go from 6th grade, graduate, come back, in some way, shape, or form, because they were connected, whether their parents were a teacher, maybe at the campus, and the parents have either shared their testimony or the graduate has shared their testimony. And they've talked about how they went to school, or they now just essentially live in their community, and knowing the skills that they learned from being hands-on on the farm has changed their perspective or their connection to food, and or they've ventured into a career within the food system. So yes, we've heard those success stories, not enough. But to your point, right here when he mentioned that the farmers are aging out, that's our biggest mission. Like, we're talking to students and changing that narrative and letting them know that this work is valuable. So, getting them from when they're 4 or 5 years old, 6, 7, 12 years old, and changing the perspective of how they connect to food and how they're finding a love and a passion, so that eventually we can hear more of those success stories, and change the data, right? Change how many folks go into the farming world, how many people care about legislation that's impacting us directly right now. We all know how much of those cuts are impacting every single one of us, and so we have to start really early, and so that's a lot of where the pride comes from. But yes, to answer your question.
Let me answer this too, Deanna, because you might remember, if you went to the farm to school map that was online 8 years ago, all these campuses would pop up in the valley, and you would be like, wait, hold on a minute, how are these school? I'm curious. Where are they getting their food? What they were doing was buying from a local intermediary, and then when you ask the intermediary, where do you get your food, it would always the same answer. I get 100% of my food out of the valley, right? And so, but that would count, because whoever's building that map would say that counts as farm to school. They're buying local, but the produce isn't locally grown, right? And of course, that's information. And you get out there, and of course, I dig deeper. I said, well, I'm not exactly sure that's what farm to school means for me. So when I see some of the work that you guys have been doing, Rocio on the school side, and all the other folks that were here earlier on the, in the purchasing side, to folks that were on the ground, that I think what we're seeing is people taking and trying to redefine the narrative of what farm to school should mean for an agricultural rich area, right? Yeah, and so, and then I'll go a little bit further, because for me, I get them a lot older than Rocio, and I'm so happy that we have this pipeline of folks like Rocio who train students at an earlier age, and then by the time we get them, they're prime and ready to go. Like Marcus Cano, who was on the stage earlier, I cannot wait to have him in our program because students like him already come running at full speed, right? And a few years ago, I had to get letters of letters from students to document the impact I had as on a teacher. And I could tell you, like, when I got some of these letters back, like, I cried because the influence that folks, teachers have, or any mentor for that matter, have on young people has been like my privilege as a teacher. And I can see that in the audience, right? I mean, I see all the teachers. You guys heard from Abraham Lopez earlier. Jose Escamilla is an alumni of our program. Stephanie Ocon, Westby, and these guys who are all here, now teachers, teaching their students. I can see that gratitude and pay dividends at this point. So, I mean, I think a lot of the early work that these farm to school teachers are doing on the ground, this generation of farm to school folks, like, who are putting our vision into action, that's the gratitude that I start to see. When I see, like, I'm going to call Marcos my grandchild because I taught his teacher, and his teacher then taught Marcos this appreciation for food systems. That, to me, is coming back to us as like, hey, look, what we're working on together has mattered for at least for Marcos, and then when he goes on to be a professional, for that great grandchild of ours. So we had a question over here.
Oh, I was going to ask one more question.
Okay.
This is policy. Paul, and we've been working together, and you converted me into an activist. But do you see that this has to grow for the future, or do you see it's going to be just like it is, where we have to fight for, as small farmers, for things?
To quote there, tarea for when you're home, look up Blanca Canales from, she was from the east coast of Puerto Rico. She said, tenemos que seguir aunque nos tome 100 años. You know, we have to keep going even if it takes us 100 years. In Puerto Rico, there's some specific bills that I've worked on that we've been presenting for like 50 years. And we know they're going to... We've been presenting it for... I personally have not been presenting this bill for 50 years, but the groups that I organize with, it's been this continued effort. Well, we've been making this argument for so long. Why? Every time you present that in your exposition of your motives, right, your data changes, you alter it to reflect that new reality. And that, every time you present that bill, it shows that narrative of how things are changing over time. It shows that consistency. Working in both the Texas state legislature and the Congress, at the state level, things tend to move much more quickly. FARFA's working on several bills, and we expect. At the federal level, I've been working 2 years on 2 bills, and that's the only thing I talk about is these 2 bills, and I've been doing it for years now. So I think we have to continue. I think we have to continue to be consistent, and even if it doesn't work out the way we want it to this Congress, well, then to work to create the more favorable conditions that we want the next time around. Something that happens to me a lot in the activism community, people say, well, I just don't like this. I don't like the situation that we're in. And I always say, well, what are you doing to change the conditions then? What are you doing to make the ground more favorable for the change shift that you want to see? And sometimes, we have to wait. I think we're going to get to a moment where it will become very clear that we're on the right side of things. So like I said, we have to continue to be consistent. We have to stay active, and building up that next generation of farm activists.
Well, Here we go. Well, thank you. That's a perfect segue actually into my question, which is for Rocio. I was lucky to sit with you at the table earlier today and kind of overhear something that, as I've been listening all day, seems to potentially be a really fantastic solution to many of the problems that we've discussed. And I'm hoping you can speak to it a little bit, and then I have a question for the rest of the panelists as well. But we've heard a lot about the need for marketing and getting these conversations outside of these doors, essentially. The power of youth or kids kind of in this problem solving, and then now, of course, data, which led to a very brief discussion of a scientific journal about or by children, which I know was like kind of jokingly thrown around, but I have become obsessed with this idea as we discussed it. So I'm hoping you could maybe talk about how powerful that could be as a way to get data, again, outside of these walls and into young hands. And then I'm hoping others could also share ways that, creative, maybe ways that others can chew on for the rest of the evening, that data could solve some of these problems, that doesn't look like data in a computer screen, running.
So, repeat your question. What exactly do you want to know?
Well, I guess I'm just challenging everyone to share like a creative data solution, if you will. And to me, that's what the conversation earlier is what sparked this question. Okay. So I know, maybe there isn't a question there that's specific to you, but it was inspired by a conversation with you.
I mean, for some context, I think we were talking about the idea of, so we all hear about peer-reviewed papers in the academic world, but there's an opportunity for community-reviewed documents or journals that are written by children for children, right? So it's still very much a brainstormy idea, but I absolutely love that you're obsessed with it, because then that means that maybe somebody else will be obsessed with it, and then we can partner and make something happen. But I think that's all I have to say. I don't think anyone can build a stronger relationship with a child than another child, right? So if a child is advocating for this program or this benefit that they've received from harvesting a few carrots, taking that lived experience, putting it in something that's easily accessible to other students who don't have that program accessible to them, may spark some, like you say, Alexis, some action, right, from the adults watching, like, hey, similar to the way that the United States government had to move on action with the National Lunch School Program, because you had community activists like the Black Panthers providing food for their community, right? They felt the pressure. They're like, hey, we're in a position to do something. So that's a very similar thought. But that's it for me.
Yeah, and just to, I think it's a great idea. And we have this community scientist group that we've developed that's been really, I thought it sounded like kind of like an academic idea that was not going to have uptake. But it's actually been really powerful. We recruit and pay community members from different backgrounds with different interests, and they go through just a little training just to kind of learn like the sort of how to not that they need to learn, but just like some ground rules about almost like a focus group setting. But they're conducting it, and then either researchers, a lot of times nonprofits, local nonprofits, community members can go to them. Sorry, I'm turned, my back is to you, but and they get paid for their time, and they give super honest feedback of everything from marketing, like product feedback, to research, sort of product types of feedback. So doing that with like using some youth participatory action research, or just doing an advisory group of youth that could become community scientists, I think would be a first step to that, and I love that idea.
So I don't know if you're familiar with the Do the Right Thing program. Years ago, I was lucky enough to be a judge for this national writing contest, and it's middle schoolers. And each year, they're given a prompt, and they write about their experience with violence. And it is in a lot of different contexts. And it's very similar to what you're talking about, asking them to talk about their experience with, it might be food, it might be with farmers, it might be with how they experience things in their lives. But it's done, I believe it's 6th grade, something along those lines, but it kind of funnels up through school districts into kind of a national, highlighting of the contest winners, but it gives all of these kids an opportunity to share their experience in different contexts with what does that look like in their home, in their school, in their life, every day, right? And so something like that could be a really exciting way to bring this work to life, right? And to bring their experiences to life and think about how to do something next.
Can I just say, go ahead, Paul, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Something you said, Rocio, reminded me of a meme I saw earlier today that the chisme is just peer-reviewed conversation. But to answer the question, specific ideas related to data. So like one of the bills that in Puerto Rico we've been working on is we have the same coastal construction laws as when Spain was in Puerto Rico in the 1800s. And we've been trying to change that for a very long time. The government of Puerto Rico says, well, there's no coastal erosion problem, but we know that for every centimeter that the water level rises, we lose three feet of coastal land. So there's this group, Movimiento Ambientalista Revolucionario, that said, upload your pictures of the beaches. And they had this national registry to upload your pictures of the beach. There's no coastal erosion, but we have all these pictures from all over the country saying that yes, there is a problem with coastal erosion. So, that's a creative way that's not, you taking data out in the field like you're in the census, but really captures the data that you want to see. Another thing, I was in Chile working as an organizer during their referendum to change their constitution. So the constitution they have in Chile is the same constitution as their dictatorship, and there was a referendum to try and change it. And there was a community that I was in that was very affected by political violence in the era of the dictatorship. There was evidence that there were X amount of cases over X period of time of political violence in that neighborhood. So they invited the grandmothers to come quilt narratives of the violence that they lived in the dictatorship. So we know that we have more or less this amount. But at the end, what was created was a quilt of years of narratives of the lived experience of this specific community during a period of time, right? So, that's not data that exists in a spreadsheet. That's, it's a quilt. But what it does is it creates this image that's so powerful, right, of these experiences that people have gone through. So, that connects, to the moving beyond the spreadsheet and more into the storytelling piece that we can create with data.
I just want to remind Rocio of this really cool project you did at IDEA with Photo Voice with Elaine Hernandez here. And I want to remind everybody at the mixer this evening, some of those Photo Voice posters are going to be on display for you all to see. So join us at that mixer at El Almacén. There's shuttles. Anyway, Bella, you can make the plug. But I think that was a really powerful way to do what everybody up there is talking about, convey this information that isn't quite research per se, but it's giving visibility to somebody's experience and seeing those posters. And Elaine, you made a whole book about it, which I still have. That was incredibly powerful for me. So that's to your question, Sarah. That's one of the things that I've seen done and done very well.
Let me just add one final point. I'm a little bit of an outlier in the way that I train our students. And for those who have gone through our program, that I'm more interested in folks who can collect information and then use that information in some capacity. And so I think which is as important as training young folks to collect data in a meaningful way is to be able to convey that data to as many users as possible. And I do think that, and I push my students to publish in peer-reviewed journals, and for those who have tried it, it's not easy. And I don't encourage it, because that like my doctoral thesis has been read by like 3 people, including my mother, who probably got to the acknowledgments page and stopped, right? And so like a lot of that information is inaccessible in general. Like, and so what's as important is training our students, our young people, to be bilingual in a sense. Now, we have an advantage here in the Valley, is that most of our students are already inherently bilingual. We're going to train them to be trilingual. How do you get your information in 2 languages out to people who can use it? If you're doing research on school children's preferences on apples, who can use that information? And how do you put it in a way that they'll take that information and put it into action? How do you put it in a language of administrators? Or how do you put it in a language for farmers, right? Taking that information that sometimes is almost uninterpretable for the common person, have the skill set to do that, and then put it in a way that actually leads to action. And that's the hardest part, to be perfectly honest, because I think more and more we've been encouraging to get high school students to write scientific papers. I'll tell you this, I did my PhD on deforestation, tropical deforestation. And to understand how many papers are written about that fact, and yet tropical forests continue to plummet, to me is a discouraging fact. We do not need any more scientific publications. What we do need are more people who can interpret that and then bring others closer to the scientific enterprise while pulling their scientific counterparts more towards that audience as well. So these are folks that we call boundary spanners, who can straddle a boundary of maybe 2 cultures, maybe of a set of users of information, and pull them closer. And this is the point of the Food Summit. Actually, this was the kind of part of it, is you see an audience here of government officials, of farmers, of food workers, farm workers, advocates, of community advocates. We're pulling together in this room, and we're practicing this craft of like, oh, I don't quite understand. What is it that you do? And then getting those young people on stage and talk about that to an audience that can be inspired by them. So I think I also love the idea of a scientific journal for and by children, but with the main point of getting them to be bilingual or trilingual in being able to understand scientific jargon, and then being able to give that data to users. So I think we're out of time. I see the... let me just say thank you to the panel. I mean, I've had the pleasure of knowing all of you, and you, Gabriela, very briefly, but I'd just like to also thank you for the work that you do, because although we're all on the same theme, we're all looking at the food system from a different lens, and every angle of information that you guys can help us with is very useful. So thanks again.